Hey guys, I'm Anar Mohawash, and thank you again for tuning in to Mint Press News' Behind the Headline. We're a citizen-led project created in partnership with Free Speech TV. Now, this show is made possible thanks to the over 300 citizen sponsors and several business sponsors. To learn more about them, you can visit our website at mintpressnews.com. Now, let's get behind the headline. We hear it every day. Why aren't Muslims speaking up against terrorism? Better yet, they say, where are the peaceful, moderate Muslims denouncing ISIS? Yet the very people asking these questions tend to ignore a major fact. Muslims are the primary victims of terrorism driven by Wahhabism, an extremist, politically motivated perversion of Islam that is held by groups like ISIS. From 2007 to 2011, 97% of terrorism-related fatalities were actually Muslims, according to the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center. And the United Nations found that from January 2014 to October of the following year, nearly 20,000 civilians were killed in Iraq, a country that is 99% Muslim, many of the victims of ISIS. Still, the UN says its figures likely fall short because they don't include casualties resulting from the secondary effects of violence, like how many people are dying because they don't have access to food, water, or medicine, which are also directly caused by groups like ISIS. Ultimately, no one wants to see ISIS defeated more than Muslims. Yet so-called experts, those who claim terrorism is a tenet of the Islamic faith, disregard the victims through a very Orientalist generalization. Muslims have been killing each other for thousands of years, they say. Let them kill each other, they add. This civilization of jihad caricature has been carefully manufactured by those on the right in both media and government within neoconservative circles who profit from war. And while it might be the political bread and butter of the right, the left has folks like Bill Maher, who has made associating Islam with violence, barbarism, and female oppression a hallmark of his career. But somewhere in the stream of Islamophobic sentiment flowing from both sides of the aisle, they managed to get one thing right. Muslims have long been victim of extremist violence perpetrated by those who claim to share their faith. In fact, Muslims by the millions have participated in an annual march in Karbala, Iraq for the past 1,300 years to denounce just that. The 40-day religious commemoration known as Arba'in, the Arabic word meaning 40, culminates in the largest peaceful gathering of humans in the world. And for many Muslims, it's steeped in a spirit of resistance. It's rooted in mourning the death of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who died at the hands of the ISIS of his time. Now, with attacks on the pilgrims by ISIS and other terror groups becoming both frequent and deadly, this spirit of resistance has taken on particular significance in recent years. Now, when someone asks, where are the Muslims denouncing ISIS? Well, they should be advised to look no further than the 20 million people who risked their lives to commemorate Arba'in in Karbala this year. But if you think the mainstream media would cover this as an important story, think again. In fact, outlets like BuzzFeed went as far as to accuse anyone saying the march was against ISIS as spreading fake news. Now, earlier this month, Mint Press republished an article from the American Herald Tribune, headlined "Media Blackout: Millions of Muslims March Against ISIS." The story explained the history of the annual pilgrimage, noting that millions of Muslims continue to make this journey despite the threat posed by terrorists like ISIS. It quickly went viral, eventually becoming a trending topic on Facebook. Now, Muslims, for once, were shown in an honest, positive light, which is a rare occurrence in the mainstream media. Now, the narrative in this story challenged the establishment's carefully crafted sectarian, violent jihadi culture caricature, a falsification used to justify those endless wars in the Middle East and Africa. And it's a vicious cycle. These endless wars, supposedly meant to target terrorists, actually give rise to the terrorism that Muslims become victim to. Of course, it wasn't long before the mainstream media chimed in. BuzzFeed did what it's been doing best lately. It bent a positive story showing Muslims united in a force of peaceful resistance against terrorism to parrot Cold War rhetoric. BuzzFeed dismissed it as just another false story that should have never gone viral. The story's author, Craig Silverman, argued that the headline was misleading. The march was not, in fact, organized in direct response to ISIS. And citing reports from the Washington Post and the International Business Times, he argued that there wasn't even a media blackout. He even went on to say that it was just Russian propaganda, since RT was the only outlet that reported the march's connection to being resistance against ISIS. Ultimately, Mr. Silverman used the story and Mint Press's decision to reprint it as an example of why Facebook needs to be more cautious about what appears in its trending section. Yet much of his proof lies in reports by mainstream media outlets that can't even differentiate between ISIS-inspired terrorism and Islam, which ultimately helps push those foreign wars and funneling weapons to extremist rebel forces that leads to more terrorism that Mr. Silverman seems to support. In attempting to address the spread of misinformation plaguing Facebook, BuzzFeed missed the point at the heart of the story. Participating in the Arba'in March is marching against ISIS. Now, for those claiming this is a false story, well, here's a little history lesson for you. Arba'in pays tribute to the sacrifices of Hussein ibn Ali, or also known as Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, he and his followers were massacred in 680 by the tyrant or ISIS of their time, Yazid ibn Muawiyah. An influential ruler from the Umayyad dynasty, Yazid ruled over many parts of the Middle East with an iron fist as he established his so-called caliphate. Now, he descended from the 1% that ruled Arabia when the Prophet Muhammad revealed his message that challenged the economic heavyweights who profited from exploiting the impoverished population. Now, generations of that 1% carried on these attempts to silence and undermine the Prophet Muhammad, his family, and his followers. Now, Hussein repeatedly refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid, a power-hungry tyrant who represented the antithesis of Muhammad's message. And this refusal eventually led to a standoff between Yazid's 50,000-man army and Hussein and his 72 family members in Karbala. Even in the face of certain death, Hussein refused to fight and refused to back down even while he and his family members were being relentlessly attacked. His refusal to accept oppression and tyranny echoes even today as an example of nonviolent resistance against tyranny that is recognized by revolutionary leaders like Gandhi. And because groups like ISIS take their lessons from tyrannical leaders like Yazid instead of Hussein, this annual march in Karbala remains a symbol of the Muslim struggle against those who purport to use their faith in the pursuit of wealth, power, and colonialism. While Arba'in is a religious procession that's considered a Shiite Muslim event, it's pluralistic in nature. Sunni Muslims, as well as Jewish and Christian leaders, also take part in the march in a show of solidarity against injustice. It's honoring the legacy of a man who died hundreds of years ago when he wouldn't kowtow to the same brand of tyranny that ISIS wants to inflict upon Muslims today. So, Mr. Silverman and BuzzFeed, marching in Arba'in is taking a stand against ISIS and terrorism. It's refusing to live in fear, and it's denouncing everything that ISIS stands for and celebrating everything that ISIS hates most. Now, that's a real news history lesson worth sharing. For almost 3 years, the residents of Flint, Michigan have had poison literally running through their pipes. The city's water supply has been tainted by lead and other dangerous pollutants since the city started drawing its water from the polluted Flint River in April of 2014 in an effort to cut costs in the economically depressed city. Now, by January of 2015, though, city officials were ensuring their own supplies of clean bottled water, and the governor's office was informed of the toxic water in February. But it wasn't until October that year that residents were warned to stop consuming the city's toxic water. Since then, though, the people of Flint have relied on bottled water for everything from cooking and drinking. Some are even hesitant to use unfiltered tap water to wash their hands or bathe. Now, to date, 600 to 1,200 children in Flint have been exposed to lead. Now, this exposure will likely create problems for years to come, as lead poisoning can lead to physical and mental development problems that can last a lifetime. Some have even argued that officials have dragged their feet on fixing the problem because the city is 57% black and 41% poor. A federal judge ruled in November that Flint residents are entitled to have bottled water delivered to their homes as a rough substitute for the essential service that municipal water systems must furnish. And on December 5th, the House and Senate finally agreed to authorize $170 million in aid to support clean Flint water. But this may be too little too late for the people of Flint, who will be feeling the effects of this crisis for decades to come and are even living now with dire illnesses due to the lead. Now, Melissa Mays, a mother from Flint and founder of the group What Are You Fighting For, is here to talk about what led to this crisis, the impacts it's had on her family, and how the government turned a blind eye while allowing Nestle to come in and pump clean groundwater for free. Check it out. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to begin the conversation by asking you, how exactly did Flint residents find out that the water was poisoned, and why did it take so long for them to be notified that there was even something wrong with the water that they were using for cooking, for cleaning, for bathing? What happened?
Well, first off, we received no notice that anything was wrong with our water until January of 2015. The switch was in April of 2014. And so basically the notice had said that for the previous 9 months, our water had been contaminated with a cancer-causing byproduct. And they didn't tell us because they didn't have to. But we were probably safe, so check with your doctor before consuming the water, which I thought was hilarious because my doctor knew nothing of the water. People had already been complaining throughout 2014 about brown water, yellow water, blue water in my case, and rashes and hair loss, but nobody was listening. The experts would just tell us, it's okay, we're scientists, trust us, it's just a bump in the road. River water is a lot harder than lake water. You're going to be fine. So when I did ask my doctor, he said, I'm not a water expert. Why would they tell you to ask me? So it went that way. And then we started testing the water in February of 2015 and discovered that there was lead. And so we still had to work for months after that. About 6 months later, we got Mark Edwards involved from Virginia Tech, and we showed that there was a widespread lead problem. The state still didn't acknowledge it for another 2 months. Basically, it's the same thing that they're doing now, that the residents, they don't matter, especially not Flint, because we have very little political power here, and we are mostly poor and minority, so we haven't had a voice, and we just don't seem to matter in their master plan.
And obviously for years, the residents of Flint have been suffering the damaging effects of water contamination, including skin lesions, memory loss, and it's even turned the process of bathing into a completely dangerous pastime. Your own family experienced horrific effects from just drinking the water. Tell me about your story and how this has affected you as a mother.
Well, showering is a nightmare. It's actually changed my hair color. It feels like it strips your skin right off. You don't ever feel clean. And then there's also breathing problems. I have to keep an emergency inhaler nearby because sometimes the steam in the shower will cause me to have what feels like an asthma attack. And I don't have asthma or COPD, and I'm a non-smoker. But my lung function has been damaged from inhaling these contaminants. My sons over the summer had to go through physical therapy every day, and they still have to do their stretches because lead settles in your growth plates. And for my 12-year-old and my 13-year-old, their growth plates started closing up prematurely. So they're hardening. So as their bones grow, their muscles and joints aren't growing. So they're in constant pain and they're hunched over. They had to stop playing sports. My youngest has a white blood cell count of 4, meaning he has no immune system. So he is sick constantly. My oldest he's 18 and he has to see an endocrinologist this month because there's something wrong with his pancreas. So we're dealing with that. On top of it, I have seizures. I'm on medication. Lead and copper is stored in your brain, and there are signal abnormalities that they found on my MRI. So I have to take seizure medications. Plus, I have IBS and diverticulosis because apparently drinking acid water is bad for your intestines. Plus, immune system issues. I've got an autoimmune disorder that looks like lupus. They're still trying to figure it out. We have just massive amounts of specialist doctor's appointments constantly because our bodies are basically flipping out and breaking down. And I'm only 38. So I have a baggie full of medications I have to take every day that I never thought I'd have to worry about for another 30 years of my life. First of all, we want all of our water bills refunded since April of 2014, and we don't pay a water bill until the water is actually safe by medical levels, not by what the state's trying to say. This past Friday, a lot of us, including myself, got shut-off notices. So they're going to shut off our poison because the state says if we don't pay up, they're not going to send any infrastructure money. So that leads us to demand number 2. We need every single piece of pipe replaced from the water treatment plant all the way up into people's homes. Their faucets, their taps, their lines in their homes, their water heaters were all destroyed by this caustic water that the state sent to us and lied. They lied for 2 years about the safety, and they still are lying. They're still trying to say that it's safe when my latest lead test that I also received in the mail on Friday is 1,740 parts per billion. 0 is the only safe level. 15 is the max when the city has to start taking action on corrosion control. And then the third demand that we want is a holistic healthcare. We still don't have proper healthcare for adults, senior citizens. We don't have the proper environmental physicians that can deal with this level of poisoning. Our doctor referred us to an environmental physician over an hour away because he said that normal PhDs, they don't know how to treat this. This is not something they deal with, not copper poisoning, lead poisoning, phosphate poisoning, the things that we're facing. Also, the bacterial outbreaks that have killed 12 people are still not being addressed. And then, of course, the last thing we want to see is accountability. We want to see laws change so this doesn't happen to your family or anyone else. But we also want to see the people that knowingly did this to us and covered it up. We want to see them behind bars.
And obviously, Flint is 57% Black and 42% of its people are living in poverty. Do you think that race and poverty played a role in the way that the response of the government was taking place?
Number one, it's
from the state
class.
government.
We are poor. We are struggling. We are below working class here because once the industry pulled out, General Motors and DuPont, AC Delco, that left us in shambles. And since we had very little political power as it is, we're in a Democratic city underneath a Republican mayor. Nobody wants to listen to us. And yeah, because we are a majority minority city, nobody wants to listen. Not the media. They all want to have this image of yelling crazy Black people. And that's not what we are. And if we are yelling and crazy, it's because we're being poisoned and lied to and people are dying and no one's doing anything. So we have every right to be emotional. But they portray us like we're crazy. So we are some of the most educated people when it comes to water chemistry because, yeah, we're poor, but we're not stupid. And I just think because we are poor, we've been summarily dismissed and they don't want to do anything with us or for us. So we just have to do it ourselves. So luckily, we've had to fight for everything that we do actually have. So Flint residents we aren't new to the fight.
And Flint is obviously, it's not a one-off situation. There are many other communities across the U.S. facing a very similar water contamination or water poisoning crisis that we rarely hear about. And there will undoubtedly be more unless something is actually done, not only about government neglect, but environmental pollution committed by major corporations that is seeping into our water supply. How often are corporations, in your opinion, held accountable for their part in such crimes? And why do you think that prosecuting them is so hard?
They put so much money into their legal team. So when you have people like us that are poor, we can't afford the huge legal battles. I mean, we're trying. We're doing everything we can. We have amazing attorneys that aren't charging us for all this work. And we're going up against the government, but also we're suing companies like Veolia and Land, which is an engineering firm. But then also General Motors, they got out of any responsibility, even though they dumped in our river for about 100 years and left it as it is. They filed bankruptcy. So corporations can do that. And people need to pay attention because this new administration that's coming in wants to further defund the EPA and get rid of clean air and clean water regulations. So if you don't think that this can happen to you, you need to wake up. And I tell people, don't forget about Flint, because if we don't get fixed with all the media attention, the congressional hearings, the criminal charges, if we don't get what we need to try to rebuild our lives, no other city that gets hit with this is going to either. So people need to step up and be like, okay, you have to fix Flint because, yeah, we're the first of so many. There's so many other cities going through this and they're being ignored, and there's more to come. I mean, you're exactly that. There's no corporate responsibility whatsoever. And when we're finding out that there's like 5,300 cities across the country that their water utilities or city or state governments are hiding the lead instead of actually fixing it, it's all over. And we need to stand up and we need to join together now to say clean, safe water. Access to clean, safe water is a human right. Also, we're bill payers. So there has to be consumer protections for this. But we're finding out that they'd rather hide it and lie than actually address it.
And I've also seen that Nestle has now made its way into Michigan. They're getting basically a free pass to pump very clean water that you and the residents of Flint don't even have access to. What is the reaction by Flint residents to this news?
The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, who failed on treating our water, just allowed them to do what they want. And then, of course, they're selling bottled water back to us because we need it to survive and everybody else in the country. So, yeah, they're robbing from our clean water and then having to give it back because we're sitting here with poisoned water. And other cities in Michigan have lead problems too. Now, Flint's bad because they did put in untreated water. The state decided to switch our water source to a contaminated river, and then they didn't properly treat it. So what happened to us in just over 2.5 years is fast and it's brutal because, I mean, it's bad enough to where bacteria is going crazy and it's killed people. But other cities are dealing with this. It's a lot slower, but it's there and it's happening. So people need to pay attention to this because our state Department of Environmental Quality is culpable in all of this. So it's not just happening to Flint with that. It's going to be other cities in the state of Michigan as well. So they need to pay attention. You have to pay attention to this.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for joining me today. We're absolutely devastated to hear the news coming out of Flint, and hopefully we'll catch up with you soon. Thank you. Adult recreational use of marijuana is now legal in 8 states and the District of Columbia, and 29 states have embraced some form of medical marijuana legalization. There's even a pot plant cultivation competition at the annual Oregon State Fair, and by 2015, legal cannabis had become the fastest growing industry in the United States, and it's expected to hit $7.1 billion this year. Now, despite this progress, nearly 700,000 people were arrested last year for violating marijuana laws, and while marijuana-related offenses aren't punishable by death, some offenders are hit with other penalties with effects that can ripple throughout their lifetime, like the loss of a job or public benefits because of life sentences. Others, like Pharrell Scott, are being separated from their families to serve life sentences for violating federal marijuana statutes. And marijuana laws don't seem to be enforced equally. According to the ACLU, it reports that blacks and white Americans use cannabis at roughly the same rate, but black arrest rates are far higher. Now, here to discuss some of the often forgotten victims of the U.S. war on drugs is Sherry Sickard. She's the founder and executive director of the Marijuana Lifer Project, a nonprofit organization fighting for an end to the criminalization of marijuana and the release of those imprisoned for marijuana-related offenses. And I began by asking her how these laws got so outrageous that nonviolent offenders are facing life sentences for pot. Check it out.
That's really something that a lot of people misunderstand, and why it is goes back to the start of the drug war, and that's a much bigger topic than we have time to discuss now. But for the people I advocate for, I'm the director of the Marijuana Lifer Project. We advocate for prisoners serving life sentences for marijuana. What got most of them into trouble is the conspiracy laws, and the public really doesn't understand much about conspiracy laws in this country. And it really shocks people that this can happen. When I talk about people serving life for marijuana, people naturally assume, well, they must have been importing tons and tons, and some of them were. But many of them weren't at all and never touched it, never had anything to do with it at all in a direct way. Or people assume, well, they must have had lots of prior offenses. They're career criminals. Some of them did, but some of them are first-time offenders. So that is also a misconception. What people don't understand about conspiracy is it takes almost nothing to be convicted of a conspiracy. You, me, everybody listening is probably guilty of a conspiracy of some sort. So what people need to realize is, one, it takes no actual evidence to get convicted of conspiracy. All it takes is the word of somebody else that was involved, and that somebody else is usually trying to avoid prison time themselves. And it holds also one person equally responsible, regardless of how much or how little they did. So among the men I advocate for, some of them were importing a lot of weed. Some of them were really minor players, like we have Craig Cecil, who repaired trucks that were used to haul marijuana, or Leopoldo Hernandez Miranda, who watched the house where marijuana was stored. So conspiracy is pretty shocking to most people when they really understand how it can work against an average citizen. And once you get caught in the justice system, it's impossible to get out.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to talk about clemency for a bit. Why hasn't marijuana legislation translated into clemency for those in prison for marijuana offenses? And how are there Americans still being given life or de facto life sentences as recent as this year for these offenses?
I wish I had the answer of why it's not being translated, and I hope as more and more states legalize, then that will become more of a push. We have seen that historically when alcohol prohibition ended. But we are one of the few countries in the first world where prisoners do not automatically get out when laws change, so they still have to petition to get out. It hasn't been a total failure. There have been some clemencies for marijuana offenders. Several of the prisoners I advocate for have gotten out over the past couple of years. Charles Cundiff, Billy Deacle, Craig Frazier, just this year, but many more have been denied. So I'm really hoping that they don't fall through the cracks, that I'm really grateful to President Obama because he's done so many clemencies, but proportionately very few of them have been for marijuana-only crimes.
And now the Justice Department's Office of the Pardon Attorney and the White House Counsel are working to deny clemency to Americans serving life sentences for possession and distribution of marijuana. What reasons have they given all of you to why they're being denied clemency, and why do you think they're giving you that very specific answer?
We're never given a reason. They just get a letter that they were denied. So there is no real reason usually. There's also no real reason when they are given clemency. I mean, the president can give clemency to anyone he wants. So we don't really know why they're being denied. It really boggles my mind. Our longest serving prisoner, for instance, Antonio Bascaro, he is 82 years old and he's been in 37 years and his clemency was denied. He's a de facto life, so he'll be out in another year, year and a half, I believe, if he lives that long. Most of these guys are senior citizens that have been in for decades, but the practice, as you mentioned, is still going on. Our newest lifer, Corvain Cooper, got a life sentence in 2014. So we're still doing this. It's not a relic of the past.
And obviously, there needs to be a lot more action taking place on a local level. What can people do to help these harsh sentencing laws and penalties, especially in terms of getting our communities involved in anti-criminalization efforts? I mean, how can we start basically a grassroots movements to change the laws?
Well, there's a lot of things starting at the local level, which is pay attention to the judges that you're electing, and because really judges have a direct impact on the public, and most people know nothing about the people they're voting for judges. Same goes with the politically appointed judges. So a lot of this starts at that level. We also need to see reform of the clemency process, of the way that is reviewed, because right now it kind of is up to the people who are in the same department that prosecuted these people to decide that they're worthy of clemency. So it kind of almost is set up as a situation where they have to admit they were wrong or made a mistake, or maybe it shouldn't have been this harsh. It's just the system is inherently flawed. So I think a push to reform that whole system would be important. And of course, sentencing reform, mandatory minimums. This is a very complex issue. But I think, and it's disheartening to me if we can't solve it at the level of something as basic as somebody with a nonviolent marijuana crime doing life without parole, which some of these guys have life without parole. Think about that. Not even a chance of ever getting out. If we can't solve that, I mean, how broken is the system?
Thank you so much, Sherry.